I'll just say, hi everyone.
Hi everyone. All right, these are the Fujifilm. Whoops. Take two. You better be shooting in manual mode, in manual mode only. Manual mod. You have ambitions of being a professional photographer, you better get into full auto. I mean, full priority mode. I mean, what's the other one? Full manual mode. Subscribe, hit that notify. Oh, come on, John. If you haven't hit that like, like the video, hit that like button. Hit the like button. Every country's got a boy racer. Itchy nose, itchy nose, itchy nose. The reality is, great photographers know how to shoot both in full manual and priority mode. And understanding your camera and understanding all modes is what's going to improve your photography. Fujifilm kindly sent me these two caps. These are the Fujifilm X series caps. They are baseball style caps. Very cool. I have two more videos coming out soon over the next couple of weeks. One of them is going to be a review on the 1680, the new lens from Fujifilm, as well as a discussion I'm having over full frame and crop sensor cameras. I'm going to be doing a promotional giveaway. So I haven't decided how I'm going to do it yet, but I will let you know. So subscribe, hit that bell icon so you get notified of my upcoming videos. And you could be someone wearing a new Fujifilm cap. In this demonstration, I'm going to be using the Fujifilm X-T3. I just want to give a brief sort of description on how exposure works on your camera or how you adjust it. Technically speaking, your aperture, which is AV, aperture value, and shutter speed, TV, time value, control exposure. All right? Aperture value is in reference to sort of quantity, if you view it that way. It's the amount of light that enters the lens, which is also determined by the type of lens, the specifications of the lens that you're using, how wide the aperture can go, and so on and so forth. The shutter is different. The shutter is a time value. That's why it's called TV. So on some cameras, you'll notice that AV represents aperture, which is aperture value. TV represents shutter, which is time value. Because with time value, you're referring to the amount of time that the light hits the film plane or the sensor. So just bear that in mind. Technically speaking, these are the two aspects of exposure. ISO technically isn't. If you see ISO as part of the exposure triangle and you've been taught that way, I have no issue, and you'll be 100% good to go if you keep shooting that way. So it's important to get it in camera as close to where you want it as possible, and understanding ISO as part of that is 100%. So what ISO is applied gain. All right, so it's unlike film. Digital cameras are very different, and each one of these has characteristics associated with. So with aperture, characteristic associated with it is depth of field. Now, it's not the only thing that controls depth of field. Distance from subject, focal length control depth of field. But effectively, the wider the aperture, the smaller the number, the shallower your depth of field, area of focus. By increasing that number, which is effectively closing your aperture, you are increasing your depth of field. But again, it's also determined by how close you are to your subject and what focal length you are using. So that's a characteristic associated. So when making decisions, it's not just exposure decisions you're making, you're also making creative decisions, for example, depth of field. Your time value or your shutter. All right, a characteristic associated with time value or shutter speed is motion blur. Now, this motion blur can be motion blur created by your subject. It can also be motion blur created by your hands, your camera shake. So you may deliberately bring blur into it, you may not, you may do long exposures. You might do night skies, you may do waterfalls, you might get blurred water, whatever it's going to be, star trails, things like that. That's all associated with your time value, your shutter. All right, a characteristic of ISO is noise. Okay, the more signal that's coming in, the more light that's coming in, your signal to noise ratio is increased, meaning your noise on the image is decreased. When less of a signal comes in and you're having to amplify your gain or apply gain to the image, effectively you're shortening that and your signal to noise ratio is decreased, meaning you're going to have more noise in the image. All right. Now remember, a lot of people refer to it as grain. I don't really care if you call it grain. Technically though, it's not grain, it's noise. All right, grain is found on film, although with Lightroom and all these products you can apply a fake grain to your image if you like that. If you really want to technically be correct, it's referred to it as noise, not grain. But nevertheless, each one of these three aspects of exposure is represented by what's called stops, or measured in stops of light. Okay, so what you'll see on your lens, for example, you have 1.2, which is actually a third stop down. So let's start at 1.4. 1.4 to f2 is one stop. f2 to f2.8 is one stop. 2.8 to f4 is one stop. So it's measuring it in one stop adjustments, and you'll notice that there's little clicks in between. Those are referencing third stop adjustments between your full stop. If you go to your ISO dial, you'll see that it's represented by 200 or 160 is the base ISO on this camera, which is a third down as well. But let's start at 200, for example. 200 to 400, which is the next one marked, is one stop. 400 to 800 is one stop. 800 to 1600 is one stop. Now, a lot of people get caught up in fake ISO and ISO is irrelevant and all this nonsense, but the reality is you don't shoot this camera because you're trying to shoot it like another camera. You shoot this camera because this is the camera you have in your hand. And all you really got to know here in ISO is that each one of these is exactly a stop increment. So whether Fujifilm or Sony or Canon or Nikon don't keep to a standard when it comes to ISO, it doesn't have an actual measured standard, that's not really the point. The point is that you're working in stops of light and you need to know how to adjust a stop. So if you're looking for a stop, you know where to get it from. Shutter speed, unlike the other two, unfortunately is not represented in thirds of stops. It's just represented in full stops. So for example, 60th to 125th to 250th to 500th to 1000th to 2000th, those are one stop increments of light. Okay. When I refer to correct exposure, I'm not referring to middle gray. I'm not referring to your photometer on your camera. I'm just referring to the exposure that you want to get, whether that be underexposed or overexposed, high key, low key, whatever it is. Okay, so I don't want to get too technical on that. But you'll notice on your screen at the back, you have a little sort of a meter there on the side. 0 meaning zeroed out, correct exposure. So when you're adjusting your exposure, doing full manual, and you're making adjustments like this, and you're adjusting your aperture, your ISO, and your shutter, you'll know if you're over or underexposed by your meter on the side. Or if you're fortunate like I am to own a mirrorless camera, you can get a live preview of what your exposure looks like, including your depth of field. Now, there's reasons why cameras are designed in the certain positions they are. Okay, I've noticed a lot of full manual shooters like adjusting ISO. All right. My question is, or at least to point out, is ISO on this camera, for example, is all the way on the left. All right. Exposure compensation is on the right, and your command dial front and back is on the right. This is the furthest point from your right hand. So while you're shooting, you effectively got the lens in your left hand. You're adjusting aperture. Now you're taking your hand away from your aperture and you're moving it up here. Now, obviously, when my face is close to this viewfinder, it gets a little bit awkward to change that. And I personally don't believe it's the most comfortable way to shoot. Now, I'm not telling you how to shoot. I'm just saying there's a reason why ISO is on the left-hand side of the camera. All right. So, looking at full manual. Now, I use full manual a lot. Now, the problem I find, if I'm going to be shooting a lot of natural light setups where I'm not using flash and I'm not doing any, where I've got more time over the shot. The problem with full manual is that at best you're making one adjustment. At worst, you can make up to 3 adjustments. So if you've got dramatic light changes from one scene to the next within a very short space of time, changing one of these is not simply going to be enough. All right. So you might You might be at f2, for example. You might be sitting at sort of 800 and you might be at 60th of a second. And you're shooting in a light environment and you step to your right and you go into a lighting environment that's maybe 3 stops darker than what you were. Well, your natural inclination would be to open up your aperture. But effectively, you've only got 1 1/3 stop there. So you're still going to be looking for another stop plus 2/3 of a stop. And you need to get it somewhere else. So you're either going to go 1 full stop and 1/3 on your ISO dial, or you're going to slow your shutter speed down, but then you started getting to the range where it's not possible to hand hold anymore. So you can see in that situation, as good as you think you are at shooting manual, you may miss a shot, and this does happen. And that is the reality. You know, are you willing to lose shots in certain situations? Now, I understand many of you are very good at this and you pride yourself in the way you shoot. So my advice in this situation is no problem if you shoot full manual. No problem if you're very good at it. But maybe look at the way in which you shoot full manual. So one of the options that you have, by going into your menu, all right, and you go down to your spanner button, which is your setup, and you go into it and you go to button dial settings, what you'll notice is that right at the bottom on the first page, ISO dial setting A. So when your ISO is set to A here, at the moment it's set to auto ISO. But by changing that to the command dial, effectively what you've done is you've taken responsibility away from this dial, but obviously you're locking it off on A. And now the command dial, either one, whichever one you prefer, becomes the ISO dial. Now you can see how handy that is because yes, you're making shutter speed adjustments right here because it's on the right hand side. Yes, you're making aperture adjustments because your left hand is on the camera. But now all you're doing is you're just using a dial to make those adjustments. So you don't have to bring your hand up and do this ridiculous thing while your face is right next to the viewfinder. So that's just one way of looking at it. Okay. You can even go further than that. So while we're in that same mode, all right, we go down to button dial settings, and we go to one, I think it's the third page on it. It's number 3 of 3. You've got aperture ring setting, and you can also change that from auto to command. All right, so by turning your lens all the way to A, keeping your ISO on A, one of the dials can now be your aperture adjustment, one of the dials can be now your ISO adjustment. Now, I think in a way it loses the fun of why you shoot Fuji in the first place. I love to change my aperture on my lens. But if you come from a DSLR, for example, if you come from a very automated type of setup where, you know, it's a lot easier to make smaller hand movements to make adjustments, this might suit you. All right, but to add to that, there's a third option. At the moment, you would normally be shooting manual with your shutter speed. If you take that all the way to T, time value, I don't know what T stands for, I presume that's what it's referring to, you effectively now are going to make one of the command dials your shutter speed. Now you're asking, there's 3 aspects to the controlling exposure and there's only 2 command dials. The way you can set it up on Fuji is that the front dial, for example, can have 3 taps to do 3 different things, the back dial just 1. So you can effectively go, the mode that it's in now is ISO, push it in, now it's aperture, and then the back is shutter speed, or whatever way you want to do it. You can make all 3 in the front, so tap 1, tap 1, tap 1. Now obviously it might be a bit slower because you've got to do 3 taps, and by using both you might get a better effect. But no, you understand that don't just view it as simply as, well, I got to shoot it by controlling these dials while I'm shooting, because it does get a little bit more complicated, especially if you're shooting on the fly. You might be a street shooter where you're just walking around and you've got time to set up your shot where you've got your exposure before the person walks into frame, those sort of things, and it's fine. Shoot the way, in this video, shoot whatever way you want to shoot. But at least now you know if you're a full manual shooter and that's only the way you would like to shoot, there are different ways of shooting with a Fuji camera, not just using your dials. Next up, I'm going to be talking about flash photography and full manual control. It's very important to set up your screen correctly, whether it's your LCD or viewfinder. Go to the setup section, go to screen setups, and look for preview exposure white balance in manual mode. You have an option of turning off your preview exposure or your preview white balance. And what I do as well, which makes it a lot easier, is I actually set up a function button where I can actually access this button by tapping it. I can turn off my preview and turn it back on again. It's very important in those dark situations where it's so dark and you're exposing for really low ambience that your subject is now silhouetted or in the dark and you can't see them in your viewfinder. But obviously by boosting it, you can now see the subject in front of you. So I've set it up as function button number 4, which is your left-hand pad button. But obviously you can set it up whatever you want. So when I tap this, preview comes on. When I tap it again, only shows white balance. When I tap it a third time, it turns off. So here's a photograph where you can see I'm underexposing it. So that's how the scene actually looks, for example. I now hit the function button on the pad. It now boosts the EVF. So that's not actually the exposure. That's just a boosted EVF or LCD in this situation. I take the photograph and I play it back. And obviously it plays back the actual exposure I took. It's very important to know this when using flash. With the flash on my camera, I've got full ETTL support where the flash is working out what I've set my exposure triangle to, or at least those two and my ISO, whichever way you look at it, lights up my subject, and the way I've set this up determines how much ambient light comes in. So I'm going to give you an example what you would do normally. So let's just say I've set it at 1/25th, I'm at 1600 ISO, and let's just say I'm shooting one person at f2 with this lens. All right, get the shot, ambience is perfect. But now a bigger group of people come and you've taken a step backwards, but you're worried f2 is a little bit too shallow a depth of field to get everyone, because you're not going to have time to move everyone exactly perpendicular to the lens. You know, everyone's going to be shifted. And generally, what you definitely don't want to be doing is pulling focus on the back person, but you really want to get as many people in focus as possible. So let's just say, for example, from f2, I go to f4. Effectively now, I've affected my ambience in the back by 2 stops. From f2 to f4 is 2 stops. So what would you do? Okay, well, you need to find that somewhere else. Now, don't worry about the flash. The flash is ETTL. It's working out what it needs to light the people up for you. It's doing it all automatically, and it knows what you're setting the camera to. It's part of the exposure. So because you've lost 2 stops of ambience, you would then go look for your ambient control from your shutter or from your ISO. So generally speaking, in dark environments, your flash has the ability of freezing your subject. So you can shoot at far lower shutter speeds in dark environments because the flash pulses out and effectively freezes your subject. So you can go as low as 60th or 30th. So in most cases, I'd go from 1/25th to 1/30th. That makes up for the 2-stop adjustment that I've made on my aperture. Get the shot, walk away. I got the exact same ambience at the back of the frame, and my subject is lit up completely. Now, if you were to just go and shoot this, you'll get the shot, but you will see a 2-stop adjustment in your ambience, and then maybe in post-production you can bring it up with full. So it all depends on how much time you have, how quick one shot goes to the next, and so on and so forth. So this is one way to look at it. You could have also pushed the ISO, but remember, 2 stops you're already at 1600 ISO. 2 stops is now 6400 ISO. That's a big jump up, especially from a signal to noise ratio. You're looking at far more noise in the image. So think about where you are, what environment you're in. The darker the environment, the more chance of you going at a lower shutter speed, handheld, because your flash is freezing your subject for you. So just to go over that again, you were f2, you 1/25th, 1600 ISO, bigger group stands in front of you, turn your aperture to f4, you're looking for 2 stops of light, you go from 1/20th to 1/30th, and you've got the shot. And everything stays the same from a lighting perspective. Obviously, another way of doing this, if you don't want to be doing the adjustment on this, is that you keep these 2 set parameters, you turn this to T, and then your command dial does that for you. So you can go back and forth with your shutter adjustment to get your ambience right. And that's entirely up to you. Or if you keep to 1/25th, while it's set in there, by using the front dial, depending on which one you've set it up, front or back dial, you can make third adjustments as well. So by shifting this, it allows you 2/3 down and 2/3 over the dial here. And then if you want to make a full adjustment in a full stop adjustment, then you have to go back to the dial and actually make that. So sometimes you're not looking for a full stop, sometimes you're just looking for a third, because you might have gone from 1.2 to 1.4, and there in that situation you just hit your control dial by keeping it there, either 1/3 down, 1/3 up. So hopefully that makes sense. Now another place where I use full manual control is when I'm using flash photography outdoors, ambient light flash combination. This is very common. I mean, this is used at most weddings. This is used on couple shoots, engagement shoots, day after shoots. Generally one light setup, could be more. But it's very, very important in these situations that you use full control. All right, people ask why? Well, not only do we know that aperture, shutter control the exposure, ISO, your gain, we know that they have characteristics as in depth of field, motion blur, and noise. They also have another feature. Aperture and ISO are what's called universal adjustments when it comes to flash, and shutter is called a local adjustment. All right, so let's set up a scenario. I've got a scene that I want to photograph. I've framed it before the couple have stepped into the frame. I'm very happy. In my preview mode on my screen, I can see my ambient exposure, and I'll end up shooting at f2.8 for a reasonably shallow depth of field, just enough for the two people so I get both in. And I'm shooting at 1/25th because full manual flash, if you're not using TTL, and I do a lot of full manual flash outside, you get more power, better recycle times, things like that. My sync speed is 2/50th of a second. All right. So generally, let's just say I'm shooting at 1/25th. All right. So I've got a little bit of leeway. I'm happy with the ambience. Generally, the ambience is about a stop or two under what your flash is going to be, because by underexposing ambient light, you give the illusion of more contrast, more richer colors. The sky looks a little bit more intense, especially sunsets, things like that. So just bear in mind, a lot of the time, that's about a stop or so under. So let's just say I step the clients into the shot. I frame them where I want to frame them. I set up the flash, bang a couple of flashes off, and adjust the flash until I'm happy. Perfect. They lit correctly, ambient lit correctly. I'm shooting. But now 10 minutes is gone and the ambient light has dropped dramatically because it's sunset. Well, what are your options? So many people make the wrong decision here. So many people immediately go to their ISO dial. All right. Or they go and they open up their aperture. Right. It's far simpler than that. Remember, this is a universal adjustment. This is a local adjustment. All you've got to do is, if your ambience is dropped by one stop, you go from 1/25th to 1/60th. Nothing happens to your flash power. Your flash power remains exactly the same. This is a local adjustment. It only adjusts ambience. So your ambient light comes up and you keep shooting because the flash is set up and aperture and ISO hasn't been adjusted, so your flash power hasn't been adjusted. So just remember, local adjustment only. All right, so let's create another scenario. Let's just say I've got a similar exposure. The flash is as close as it can get. It can't get any closer. I'm at full power, full 1/1 power. The flash is going mad. You just don't have enough light on that flash. Well, how do you handle the situation? Well, it's simple. Let's say, for example, you don't mind going a little bit shallow with your depth of field. Well, you turn your aperture ring to f2. The whole scene comes up, ambience and flash. All right, so you're getting the flash power you want now by one extra stop. But the problem is that you've raised your ambience and you weren't happy with raising your ambience. Well, it's simple. You remember that your shutter is ambient light only. You just go back and you put that to 2/50th. One stop back down. Flash stays where it is, where you want it. Ambience has come down by one stop. And you got the shot. Let's create another scenario. All right. Let's just say, for example, you're shooting at 2.8, but you don't want to go shallower than that. And there is no more power left in the flash, the same scenario as before. Well, there's another option. You need one more stop of flash power. You go from 400 to 800. Boom, the whole scene goes up, but ambience goes up as well. And all you do is you go back to your shutter and you drop a shutter on your shutter speed, drop a stop on your shutter speed, and everything's back to normal. So you can understand, by making small adjustments and understanding exactly how these three work in flash photography is so important. Now, obviously, you can go automated with flash photography because you get TTL flash, but the same is going to apply, because effectively, you want to set up your aperture at a set aperture because you don't want that to be adjusting. You've set it up from a creative perspective. It's exactly where you want it from a depth of field perspective. All right. You can go to full auto on your ISO. That's fine. And then you could be using your exposure compensation just to go up and down. But at any stage, when you're happy to get your shot and you just want to adjust your ambient and make slight adjustments to it, your shutter still needs to be there to make that. So you might as well just go full manual, even if an ETTL flash is firing, even with high-speed sync, where your sync speed is not that important. The same applies. So very, very important.